The relationship between Bulgaria and Russia has been growing stronger, raising alarms within the European Union. On December 11, 2024, Bulgarian President Rumen Radev held talks with Russian officials, hinting at a shift in Bulgaria's foreign policy. This move challenges the EU's unified stance on opposing Russian aggression, particularly in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. The EU has imposed a series of sanctions on Russia, aiming to weaken its influence and its support for the war. Yet some critics argue that these sanctions have not been consistently enforced, and internal divisions within the EU undermine their effectiveness. Bulgaria's recent actions highlight these fractures, as the country has been granted exemptions from certain EU sanctions, allowing the import of Russian oil until March 2024. Additionally, the EU's reliance on individual member states to enforce sanctions has resulted in uneven application, with some nations prioritizing their national interests over collective EU goals. This lack of cohesion has allowed Russia to exploit divisions within the EU, challenging the Union's global credibility. The broader Western strategy toward Russia has also come under fire. While sanctions have been punitive, they have not been effective in deterring Russia's geopolitical ambitions. The absence of a comprehensive long-term strategy has left the EU vulnerable to both internal dissent and external pressures, leaving the EU's position on Russia less effective than it could be. The shift in Bulgaria's stance cannot be fully understood without considering the political instability within the country. Over the past 3 years, Bulgaria has held 7 parliamentary elections, demonstrating the deep fractures in its political landscape. This continuous instability has undermined Bulgaria's ability to pursue coherent domestic policies and effectively represent itself within the EU. The ongoing political turmoil has been exacerbated by the presence of caretaker governments that have acted as temporary solutions, rather than addressing the root causes of the political crisis. One of the key areas where this instability is apparent is in Bulgaria's stalled efforts to meet the EU's economic and governance standards for Eurozone membership. The requirements for joining the Eurozone, including fiscal discipline, legal reforms, and institutional development, have proven difficult for Bulgaria's interim governments to address. Bulgaria's failure to tackle corruption and implement judicial reforms has led to a widening gap between the country and the EU's core values. This marginalization has fueled growing skepticism toward the EU and has opened the door to alternative alliances, including closer ties with Russia. Bulgaria's pivot toward Russia directly contradicts the EU's strategy of countering Russian influence in Eastern Europe. The EU has long invested in strengthening democratic institutions and promoting transparency in post-communist nations. Yet Bulgaria's move suggests that these efforts have fallen short. The Bulgarian government has increasingly resisted EU policies, including those that isolate Russia economically and diplomatically. Bulgaria's continued reliance on Russian energy resources, despite EU sanctions and efforts to diversify, underscores the EU's limited influence in the region. At the heart of Bulgaria's shift lies its failure to embrace fundamental EU norms, particularly in areas like the rule of law and anti-corruption measures. The EU has repeatedly criticized Bulgaria for its opaque judiciary system and persistent corruption problems, which successive governments have failed to address. This has not only eroded public trust in Bulgarian institutions, but also weakened the country's integration into the EU framework. Without progress in these areas, Bulgaria's commitment to the EU is increasingly uncertain, raising doubts about its willingness to uphold shared European values. Russia has skillfully exploited these vulnerabilities, presenting itself as an alternative to what many Bulgarians perceive as the EU's detached bureaucracy. Moscow has worked to cultivate goodwill among the Bulgarian population, drawing on the historical and cultural ties between the two countries. The Kremlin's narrative portrays Russia as a dependable partner that respects Bulgaria's sovereignty, in contrast to the EU's perceived heavy-handedness. This messaging resonates particularly in rural areas and among older generations, who view EU demands for reforms as intrusive and out of touch with their daily lives. The EU's response to these developments has been inconsistent and often reactive. While Brussels has imposed sanctions on Russia and sought to reduce energy dependence, it has not sufficiently addressed the internal divisions that weaken its unity. The focus on punitive measures against Russia has sometimes overshadowed the need to strengthen EU institutions and support vulnerable member states like Bulgaria. This oversight has allowed Russia to gain influence in the region, challenging the EU's ability to project power and maintain stability along its eastern borders. Bulgaria's increasing alignment with Russia is emblematic of a deeper crisis within the EU. The inability to reconcile the diverse needs of its member states has allowed political instability and economic stagnation in countries like Bulgaria to persist. If the EU cannot address these root causes, it risks losing influence in Eastern Europe, which not only weakens its position against Russia, but also undermines its credibility as a champion of democratic governance and the rule of law. The stakes are high. The EU must act decisively to reinforce its commitment to all its members, or face further fragmentation, especially as external threats continue to grow. Bulgaria's economic and political shift toward Russia is transforming what was once a cornerstone of its foreign trade and energy strategy, signaling a significant change in the region's geopolitical dynamics. Energy dependence and the path to transition. Bulgaria has long been reliant on Russian energy supplies, particularly natural gas and nuclear fuel, essential for the operation of its Kozloduy nuclear power plant. This dependence has left the country vulnerable to the geopolitical shifts that were starkly revealed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the European Union's subsequent imposition of sanctions. Although Bulgaria has been more hesitant than some EU nations in severing its economic ties with Moscow, there are now clear signs of a shift toward reducing that reliance. Recently, the Bulgarian parliament took a decisive step by canceling several critical agreements with Russian energy firms. This move is seen as an effort to chart a new course toward energy independence. One of the most significant decisions was the termination of agreements concerning the Belene nuclear power project, a long-delayed initiative that had been largely dependent on Russian expertise and funding. This decision signals Bulgaria's growing awareness of the risks inherent in over-relying on Moscow for its energy needs. However, the journey toward alternative energy sources is far from straightforward. Bulgaria faces numerous challenges, including outdated infrastructure and a lack of a cohesive national energy strategy, which have impeded its transition. As a result, the country finds itself in a vulnerable position during this shift. In response, the EU has strongly urged its members to diversify their energy sources, offering both financial support and technical expertise to help reduce dependency on Russian energy. Bulgaria has made moves in this direction, including increasing imports of natural gas from Azerbaijan and exploring LNG, liquefied natural gas options via Greece. However, progress has been slow, exacerbated by domestic political instability, which has delayed essential investments in renewable energy and infrastructure. This sluggish pace of change reflects broader challenges within the EU itself, as it tries to implement a unified energy policy across its diverse member states. With Bulgaria's dependence on Russian energy dwindling, a new economic dynamic is emerging. Bulgaria is increasingly looking eastward, toward China. Emerging economic ties with China. In recent years, China has significantly increased its economic presence in the Balkans, and Bulgaria is no exception. Chinese investments, particularly in infrastructure and technology, have captured the attention of the Bulgarian government. Chinese companies are now eyeing key sectors, including transportation, energy, and telecommunications, positioning themselves as viable alternatives to both Russian and EU investors. This emerging partnership represents a subtle shift in Bulgaria's foreign policy, as it seeks to diversify its economic alliances beyond traditional Western partners. However, this growing connection with China raises concerns, particularly within the EU. Brussels has voiced alarm over China's increasing influence in Europe, warning member states about becoming too dependent on Beijing. Critics argue that Chinese investments often come with hidden drawbacks, such as higher debt burdens, compromises on EU procurement standards, and potential undermining of European values. For Bulgaria, this shift could put it at odds with the EU, creating additional complications in its already strained relationship with Brussels. As Bulgaria deepens its ties with China, it must balance its need for foreign investment with its commitments to the EU. This task is complicated by the country's ongoing political instability, which makes it difficult to form and implement long-term strategies. The growing relationship with China also mirrors a broader trend among smaller EU nations that feel sidelined by Brussels. For many of these countries, China offers an opportunity to secure much-needed investments without the political strings often attached to EU funding. This dynamic points to a broader failing of the EU, its inability to provide sufficient support to its more vulnerable members. By not addressing the needs of smaller, less stable states, the EU leaves these nations susceptible to the influence of external powers. For Bulgaria, the pivot toward China could strain its relationship with EU institutions, further deepening the divisions within the Union. Navigating the future. A delicate balance. Bulgaria's ongoing economic reorientation reflects the complex interplay between internal challenges and external pressures. While the country's decreasing dependence on Russian energy is an important step toward greater sovereignty, the pace of change leaves it exposed to potential geopolitical risks. Meanwhile, the growing relationship with China presents new questions about the long-term consequences for Bulgaria's role within the European Union. Bulgaria's situation highlights a broader dilemma facing many smaller EU states. the difficulty of balancing the benefits of foreign investment with the demands of EU membership. Without a clear strategy to manage these shifting dynamics, Bulgaria risks being caught in the middle of competing powers, undermining both its national interests and its place within the EU. While the European Union and Western powers have long been praised for their commitment to democratic values and economic development, their handling of Bulgaria underscores some critical flaws in their approach. In particular, it shows how the EU has struggled to effectively support its more fragile members, leaving them vulnerable to external influences and putting their long-term stability at risk. EU's approach to Bulgaria. Challenges and criticisms. There is growing concern that the European Union has not sufficiently supported Bulgaria in stabilizing its political environment, a critical factor for the country's integration into the EU's core structures, such as the Eurozone and Schengen area. While Bulgaria has made some progress, EU policies are often seen as more punitive than constructive, which has led to resentment among Bulgarian leaders and citizens alike. The EU's conditionality policy, which requires nations to meet specific benchmarks on governance, anti-corruption measures, and judicial reform, is often perceived in Bulgaria as unwelcome interference. These benchmarks, intended to align candidate countries with EU standards, sometimes fail to acknowledge the unique historical and structural challenges that Bulgaria faces. For instance, despite meeting most technical requirements for Schengen area membership, Bulgaria remains excluded, primarily due to concerns over corruption and border security. This has fueled frustration within the country, where many feel that the EU values political optics more than substantive, practical support. Additionally, Bulgaria's smaller size often results in it being overlooked in EU decision-making processes. The focus of the EU on its larger, more powerful members leaves countries like Bulgaria feeling sidelined, particularly when it comes to issues of regional security. For example, while the EU has been active in sanctioning Russia, it has not addressed Bulgaria's particular security needs, leaving the country feeling vulnerable as it sits on the geopolitical fault line between Europe and Russia. In terms of military and security assistance, Bulgaria's situation has been similarly inadequate. Although the EU provides some aid through structural funds, these are often tangled in bureaucratic red tape, delaying critical projects and rendering them less effective. Furthermore, the EU's economic support does not address the root causes of Bulgaria's stagnation, such as systemic corruption and a lagging industrial sector. Without more direct investment, Bulgaria's integration into the Eurozone remains a distant dream. This lack of sufficient EU engagement has created a vacuum that Russia is eager to fill. Bulgaria, feeling somewhat abandoned by the EU, has increasingly turned to Moscow for alternative solutions, such as energy deals and military cooperation. This is not just a matter of historical ties. It is a pragmatic response to the EU's failure to meet Bulgaria's immediate concerns. The rising influence of Russia in Bulgaria is emblematic of broader dissatisfaction with the EU's approach to its eastern members. The West's response to Russia's actions in Ukraine has done little to reassure smaller nations like Bulgaria, which feel their unique security challenges are not taken seriously. The EU's reliance on NATO to handle regional security issues has left smaller states exposed and feeling isolated. For Bulgaria, this has only reinforced the view that the EU is more interested in maintaining a unified external image than addressing the specific vulnerabilities of its smaller members. Moreover, the West's strategy of focusing primarily on punitive measures against Russia has overlooked the need for greater internal cohesion within the EU. For example, efforts to counter Russian disinformation have often been poorly coordinated, leaving countries like Bulgaria vulnerable to narratives that undermine trust in EU institutions. Additionally, sanctions on Russia fail to account for the economic interdependence between Eastern Europe and Russia, complicating efforts to implement measures that do not backfire domestically. The EU must rethink its approach to Bulgaria and other similarly situated countries. A focus on punitive conditions has clearly not worked and is, in many ways, exacerbating local frustrations. A more constructive approach is needed, one that not only provides financial support, but also offers technical assistance and political backing to help Bulgaria tackle its internal challenges. The EU should engage more deeply in the security concerns of its eastern members, offering tailored solutions for regional defense rather than relying on broad sanctions or NATO frameworks. To address Bulgaria's economic struggles, the EU could prioritize investments in infrastructure and industry, making these contributions tangible and valuable for the Bulgarian people. At the same time, it should focus on addressing issues of governance, corruption, and transparency, ensuring that EU funds are used effectively. The EU must also take steps to directly address Bulgaria's unique security needs. This includes improving military cooperation, enhancing intelligence sharing, and strengthening cybersecurity measures to reassure Bulgaria of the EU's commitment to its defense. By doing so, the EU would send a clear message to Moscow that it remains steadfast in its support for Eastern European members. Furthermore, combating Russian propaganda and disinformation is critical. The EU can support media literacy programs, independent journalism, and civil society organizations in Bulgaria, helping to build resilience against narratives that erode public trust in the EU. This is crucial not just for Bulgaria, but for the broader integrity of the EU. Ultimately, Bulgaria's future will serve as a litmus test for the EU's ability to balance idealism with pragmatic action. Failure to adapt EU strategies to better address the needs of its eastern members could have serious consequences, not only for Bulgaria but for the EU's broader geopolitical stability. Bulgaria's growing disillusionment with the EU, coupled with its increased engagement with Russia, risks destabilizing the region and undermining EU unity. This is a scenario that must be avoided at all costs. If the EU does not act now, it risks losing Bulgaria and other smaller Eastern European nations to Russia's sphere of influence. However, by shifting to a more inclusive and responsive approach, one that addresses both security and economic vulnerabilities, the EU has an opportunity to reverse these trends and strengthen its global position. Only by demonstrating true solidarity with all its members, regardless of size or power, can the EU hope to maintain its vision of a united, democratic Europe. Bulgaria's path forward will be a crucial indicator of the EU's ability to navigate the complex dynamics of the 21st century. How the EU responds to this challenge will shape its future role on the world stage, and the costs of inaction may prove far too high for Europe to bear.